I wanted to talk today about something that's really been on my heart to share, and I'm terrified, frankly, to talk about because it's such a emotionally charged topic and it's so touchy and it's so hard, I think, for us to really even process and think about. Hi, Jody. Can you let me know if you can hear me, Jody, this time? I'm on my iPad now. So this morning, I read yet another firsthand account of an individual or several individuals who had been victims of the NIH, which was the hospital, I think it was Native Indian Hospital is what it stood for. That's on Nanaimo, in Nanaimo on Vancouver Island, and that operated for many, many years. And just grappling with that information, and I know more and more information is coming out, and I've wondered, can I really speak to this because I'm Caucasian, and yet I think silence speaks loudly, and I really felt God putting on my heart that I should speak, and I realized that He has given me some unique perspectives and experiences in my own life that can allow me to speak into this really difficult topic. And I want to talk about it because we're coming up to Canada Day. We have come through such a difficult and challenging, many times heartbreaking year and a half. So many people are demoralized. So many people are just feeling a loss of hope. So many people are going through financial hardships, mental health, and like psychological hardships. And so I really just wanted to just speak to this. One of my friends was posting on some of the information that's come out about these atrocities that were committed at the residential schools and again at the NIH hospital. And someone said, I hope Christians are going to talk about this. Like, I'd like to hear you guys condemning this. And I think a lot of us aren't sure how to respond. And do we just throw our whole country under the bus? Do we throw our ethnicity under the bus because of our skin color? And how do we deal with this, and how do we process just such horrific information? And I want to give you a little bit of background about myself. So I actually grew up and spent my childhood on Haida Gwaii. I lived in the village of Mast, and we moved there as missionaries. My dad had just come out of Bible school and moved there to be a missionary. And I really do not think that he had any idea about the history of this community and missionaries. And I learned about it in more detail in university, and it really clarified for me so much why we met such open hostility. And I moved there as like a 5-year-old, and I could not understand why there was so much animosity towards just kids. Like, we were little kids, and we were just met with such open hostility. I did not realize the word missionary was basically like a swear word. It's pretty much the worst thing you could possibly be. And I experienced a lot of bullying, a lot of animosity, a lot of mocking. Just people would just spew at me as a little kid, being white. Like, it was just the worst thing was that I could be white, and I did not know how to deal with that as a child, and I just didn't understand how, like, why is this a problem? we're people. We're people. Like, why the fixation on my skin color and my ethnicity? And I did not understand that so much of what's coming to light had happened over the generations in Masset and on Haida Gwaii, and how so much of their culture had been erased, that they believed that, you know, the churches came in, missionaries came in and thought, we're going to civilize these people, we're going to take the paganism out of them by erasing their culture. Like, they couldn't seem to separate their culture from their beliefs, and I can understand why, and yet it's so wrong. And as I learned about the way that their culture was attacked, and how they would perceive it that way, and how some of these church denominations came in and partnered with the government and spied on them, reported back to the government, and they were really complicit in a lot of these just terrible discrimination that these people faced. I feel like, and I can also speak to this as an auntie to two beautiful boys who have their Aboriginal status. My two nephews, my third is due this week, and I can't imagine being a mother and having to worry about your child having their, you know, when I grew up, I apologize, I'm going to get things wrong, I'm going to say things wrong, please have grace with me, but I cannot imagine your child being identified as having Native status and worrying about some government official coming in and removing your child from your home because they think they know better for your child. And they're doing it for the good of society. It's appalling to me. And so I just want to say that. I also come at this as someone who grew up with my Uncle Ronnie. And I will probably not be able to talk about him without crying because I miss him. My Uncle Ronnie was born with very severe mental and physical disabilities. He didn't walk till he was, I can't remember, my grandma would be able to correct me if I was wrong, but I know he didn't walk till he was past 5 years old. He was nonverbal. He was born into a very loving family. My grandfather was city police officer from a long line of police officers. My grandma nannied. She wanted a big family. And he was very loved. And my experience with residential schools is through my Uncle Rodney. My grandma had government officials coming in all throughout his life, trying to convince her that they knew better for how to raise him, and that she wasn't equipped, that she didn't have the training necessary and the expertise to raise him with his set of disabilities and the challenges that he would face, and that they were better equipped, and that she should leave it to the professionals for the needs of her child. And this went on and this went on, and finally my grandma decided when he was 8 years old to send him to the residential schools. And these were residential schools for children with mental and physical disabilities, but especially mental disabilities. And he lived there for 2 years. And when he was 10 years old, my grandparents pulled him out. They pulled him out, I think, on the spot. They watched the toll, the psychological toll it took on him. He regressed so much. He was bullied. He was mistreated. He was bullied by other children, because these are a whole bunch of children without parents, right? Without the love and nurture of a parent. And I watched him years later, just emotional about that experience, and just how negative an experience it was, and how my grandma listened to them, and they're just them feeding her with this lie that they knew what was best for her son, that they could take care of him better, that they were the professionals. She wasn't a professional. You know, how could you possibly know what your child needs? And just robbing her of the confidence to know what was best for her own child, until she stood up and said, no, I know what's best for my child. I can see what this is doing to him and his mental health. And she pulled him out of that school, and she never looked back. And for years, forever, his whole life, I saw social workers come in and try to convince him that he would be better off somewhere else. And I just admire my grandma so much, because she stood her ground, and I watched her love and meet the unique needs of my uncle. And so I've heard many stories just of the schools with him. And so a lot of thoughts have gone through my mind. I'm going to try so hard not to ramble. This is hard. I'm so nervous. I just want to speak to this as a Christian. I want to speak to this as a mother of 4 children. I want to speak to this as a Canadian. I want to speak to this as a patriot. I want to speak to this as an auntie of beautiful nephews who have their status, Aboriginal status. I want to speak to this as a child who grew up in a community that was almost entirely, back then, Native, Aboriginal. And I want to speak to this as that white kid who faced so much hostility because of our history, and what I didn't understand about it. One of the things that really struck me is, I guess one of the questions that's come out is, I've seen people talk about, well, you know, all these graves that we're finding, like, why is this coming out now? You know, is this timing of it insidious? Were these all nefarious deaths, or were these just graveyards? And I've wrestled with that and thought about that. And I just want to speak to that, because I think it doesn't matter if any of those graves were natural causes. And I want to illustrate this from another account. We have a lot of first-hand accounts now of what went on, and I want to read a first-hand account to you, because I think it illustrates the points that I would like to make. This is a first-hand account from another occasion of another atrocity and human rights violations. I have personally seen through the observation window of the decompression chamber, where a prisoner inside would stand in a vacuum until his lungs ruptured. They would go mad and pull out their hair in an effort to relieve the pressure. They would beat the walls with their hands and head and scream in an effort to relieve pressure on their eardrums. These cases usually ended in death of the subject. About 200 inmates were subjected to these horrors before the experiments were concluded. This was not here in Canada, and I don't want you to think it was, but I want you to hear the similarities. This was conducted by a doctor, Dr. Rascher, and he ended up in a prison cell with Dietrich Bonhoeffer and many other German patriots who fought against men like this man. And yet they got to know him. And surprisingly, he was very personable. He was very loyal. He was funny. He had seemed like a really well-adjusted person. And yet, it was very hard for them to match that with what is described about this man. So one of the men who shared a cell with him said that this American said, best explained that Rascher had very seriously thought that the experiments he had conducted were fully justified by the great value of the scientific results obtained. He quite obviously saw nothing wrong in exposing a couple of dozen people to intense cold in water or air and then attempting their resuscitation. He was in fact very proud of having discovered a technique which he said would save the lives of thousands who would otherwise have died from exposure. I read the accounts of this guy. I felt sick. I couldn't believe that afterwards they described this guy as like a really pleasant, normal seeming human being. I was appalled. And this is what he said in a letter. This was a letter he wrote to Himmler, and it just blows my mind. In these Christian medical circles, the standpoint is being taken that it goes without saying that a young German aviator should be allowed to risk his life, but that the life of a criminal who is not drafted into military service is too sacred for this purpose, and one should not stain oneself with this guilt. This is what he writes to Himmler. We should not get angry about these difficulties. It will take at least another 10 years until we can get such narrow-mindedness out of our people. But this should not affect the research work, which is necessary for our young and splendid soldiers and aviators. And I will not go on to tell you these experiments that he conducted. And it's one of the things why I think I have a deep appreciation for history, and I've been harping on this whole year the need to know history so we do not repeat history. And the fact of the matter is we have repeated history. We have repeated this history, and we have repeated this history in Canada. When I was on the phone with Amnesty International, that was one of the things we talked about. I was asking her some questions, and she and just what their role is, what role they play in dealing with advocacy groups and some of these constitutional constitutional lawyers that represent people when basic human rights are being violated. And she said one of the critical roles they play is in the research, the data gathering, and she gave the example of their involvement here in Canada with these human rights, these wars against crimes against humanity that have been proven to have occurred in the Aboriginal populations, or indigenous. I'm saying the wrong word, and I apologize, but it's changed many times in my lifetime, and I quite honestly, if I'm being honest, this is another person example. My uncle used to joke about when they would come to see him, the social worker, and he'd say, "What is my label today? What are you calling me today?" Because they would correct my grandma when she used the wrong terminology. He's like, "You've called me this, you've called me this, you've called me this, you've called me this." Like, like the name. And he used to think it was funny. And I guess I feel angry that we get called, that people get called out, and that our government has made distinctions about whether a person is Indian or Native or Aboriginal or Indigenous, and they cover up this kind of horrible information about what they have done because of a person's ethnicity. And so I hope that will come across that I condemn this. This is an account I read today. This is Canada. The official censorship went further. Information had come out about the National Indian Hospital. I think that was what the NIH stood for. This is as late as 1999. The media reported on the allegations of this hospital, and the federal government officially sealed its archives on the hospital and other Indian hospitals across Canada. But separate records held at the UBC Kerner Library confirmed that major funding for the National Indian Hospital was received from both the Defense Research Board and the United Church of Canada to conduct classified experimental research on generations of Aboriginal women and children. One first-hand account described she was taken when she was 3. They told her mother she had TB and needed to be treated at the hospital. They kept her till she was 18. Her mother made a fuss, she says. So they put her there in the hospital with me too. So they took them both. She said they did that to a lot of Indian families all over the island. Every morning they were taking little dead bodies out of the wards on these metal gurneys. My cousin Nancy saw them bury those kids in the field behind us, up near the highway. Another distant cousin of Joan's, Esther Morris, was incarcerated at the NIH during the 1960s. In 2007, she went public. And this is her description. They kept me strapped into this weird device so I could never lie down or stand up. Just held like that for months on end, says Esther. I lost the use of my legs. An orderly said it was for space research. It was funny because some of the doctors couldn't speak English and they needed a translator. And yet they're using this girl because of her ethnicity. They're using her for this research, for the betterment of mankind, for the betterment of science, for the advancement of space research. It makes me sick. There are so many more accounts like that. Many of them are documented in the book, Murder by Decree. And does it sound familiar? Does it sound not similar to this German scientist who rationalized that he was bettering humanity, that he was proud of his work and his experimental research on these Jewish criminals, or delinquents as he saw them, in order to save the lives of great soldiers and war heroes. So we might ask ourselves, did everybody in these graves that we're uncovering die because of nefarious reasons, intentionally? Would we ask that question of Nazi Germany? Would we ask that question of the accounts of the Holocaust? Or do we know we have so many eyewitness accounts, personal first-hand reports of how wrong the people in these concentration camps were treated? And I think the same is true of what we know about when it went on in these residential schools and hospitals. So, I was trying to be brief, but it's not going to be brief. I am sorry for that. But I really need to share just what's on my heart. We must condemn this. I think there's no question we must condemn these evil acts. We must look at what led to these evil acts. We must understand what kind of psyche leads a civilized nation to perform these kind of atrocities on children and on families. We need to learn from our history in order to move forward and in order to never repeat these mistakes. And I fear that we are repeating these mistakes even today.